Chairman Powell, I have a series of questions for you, and I'd love to have your answers on these questions. You testified yesterday regarding the bank's balance sheet, which stands at roughly $4 trillion. And you gave an answer about sort of normalizing the balance sheet and what your view of that normalization looks like. And you referenced the demand for reserves as a reference point for that. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So before the financial crisis, the size of the Fed's balance sheet was a function of demand for our liabilities, principally currency and to a far less extent reserves. Quantitative easing comes along. We hit the zero lower bound. The Fed buys a lot of assets. That was about buying assets. And the size of the balance sheet as a percent of GDP went from 6% to 25%. And that was really driven by a desire to buy longer-term credit assets, or rather federal government debt, and drive down longer-term interest rates. So now we're normalizing the balance sheet, and normalizing it really means going back to a situation where the size of the balance sheet is driven by demand for our liabilities, which has evolved. So currency and reserves mainly. So what's happened is demand for currency has grown. Outstanding has grown much faster than the economy, and demand for reserves is now much higher than it was because really we require banks to hold very high levels of high-quality liquid assets, and they choose to hold reserves. So we can't go back to that very small balance sheet. So what we think is that the committee's been working on this carefully for the last 3 FOMC meetings and devising a plan. We're close to agreeing on a plan which would sort of light the way to the end of the process.
And do you plan to communicate that?
Very much.
That plan?
Yes, we do. When it's agreed, we've found it's good to be very careful with the balance sheet.
But your reference point was about $1 trillion in bank reserves at the Fed would be the reference point for when you sort of end the reduction of the balance sheet.
So there's tremendous.
Do you have a time frame on that?
Yes. There's a lot of uncertainty around the actual level. What I did was I cited public estimates and said those appear reasonable. We actually don't know what the equilibrium demand will be. We're going to have to find it over time.
Okay.
And my guess is we'll be announcing something fairly soon.
So in light of yesterday's housing figures, which housing starts fell the lowest number in more than 2 years, what impact do those housing figures from yesterday have in your timing on holding rates steady? Or do they have any impact?
So in terms of what we said is we're going to be patient and watch as the economy evolves and also as the evolving risk picture changes and how that will affect the outlook. And we'll be looking at a full range of data. It would include housing starts. It would include anything that can affect our achievement of the dual mandate, principally growth, and then, of course, the labor markets and inflation. So we'll be looking at a wide range of data. That's one piece of it, but it's one of many pieces.
So related to that, housing finance reform. Fannie and Freddie are more than a decade into nationalization. You are a major holder. The Fed is a major holder of these assets. Do you think that it's important for Congress to prioritize housing finance reform for the American economy?
I do. I very much do. This is a big unfinished piece of business for sort of the post-crisis era, and I think it would be good for the economy and to move to a system where a lot of private capital is there supporting housing risk again, and it's not just all winding up on the federal balance sheet.
Okay, pivoting to result of some recent statements. There are a lot of cross currents, conflicting signals in the terminology the Fed has used in the U.S. economy and the global economy. How do you respond to those who say you're making financial market stability an unofficial mandate to the Fed's decision making?
No, I wouldn't say that's what we're doing. First, I think financial stability has been part of the Fed's role. In fact, it really was our original role. Central banks generally evolved out of a desire to support the stability of the financial system. It's always been something that we've done. Our mandate from you is maximum employment and stable prices. That is the mandate. We also look after financial stability, and particularly as it supports the dual mandate.
Financial stability, but not necessarily stock market stability.
No, by financial stability, we're really talking about the capacity of the financial system, particularly banks, but other aspects of the financial system to perform their role and intermediate between savers and borrowers and support economic activity.
So what do you say to those folks who claim there's now a Powell put on the market or in the market?
Anything that matters for the dual mandate matters for us, and financial conditions our tools work through financial conditions. So I would say that when there are major changes in broader financial conditions, as you point out, not any one market or set of markets, but when they're for a sustained period, important changes in broader financial conditions, that matters for the macroeconomy, it matters for achievement of the dual mandate, and we'll of course take that into account.
So you mentioned the headwinds internationally, the softening in the EU, the softening in the Chinese economy, the risk of Brexit. We see what's happening internationally for global terror and things of that sort. But I want to talk specifically about China and ask you about this. So how does China's use of state-run banks to allocate credit affect financial stability for the rest of the world?
I don't know that there are important implications for global financial stability. It is a part of their system. I mean, I know they're trying to move to a more market-based system over time, and that's a challenging transition.
So more to this point, it's an opaque market. So getting numbers and getting a solid understanding of that allocation of capital is much more difficult in China than it is in the rest of the first world. Is it not?
That's right. That's right. So, in addition, so much of their economic activity, in effect, has the backing of the central government.
So, let me just wrap up with a broader question. You mentioned our national debt. The debt and deficit challenge is a real one. I firmly believe we've got to right-size our spending, commensurate with long-run obligations that we have to the American people. But fundamentally, our deficit does have an impact on your dual mandate, does it not?
I would say in the longer run.
In the longer run. And our national debt, too, in the longer run, has an impact in Fed policymaking as it results in stability and full employment, does it not?
I would say the unsustainable path of the federal government is a longer run problem. It doesn't really affect, most of our thinking is about business cycle frequencies and supporting the economy when it's weak and holding it back when it's overheating. But that's just in general, and not so much about fiscal unsustainability. But we worry about, in the longer run, what will happen is we'll wind up spending our money on interest payments rather than on the things we really need.
Yield back.
Thank you very much.